He did exactly what he was trained to do. And because of that, 4 billion people died. How does someone get promoted for ending a world? I was never meant to be remembered. My name is Halrix Morn, and I was an Adept Inspector, 3rd class in the Administratum's Compliance Verification Division, subsector Obscurus, a position so minor that most of my colleagues could not recall my face even after years of service alongside me. I processed reports in a windowless chamber aboard the orbital station Sanctus Veritas. My days measured not in hours but in the rhythm of keystrokes, the hum of cogitator arrays, and the slow accumulation of parchment that turned my fingertips grey with ink and dust. I was one among millions, a single neuron in the vast and indifferent mind of the Imperium, and I performed my function with the quiet devotion expected of those who serve without glory. I never sought to change the course of history. I never imagined that my adherence to protocol, my careful attention to the most mundane details of imperial bureaucracy, would unravel a plan centuries in the making and condemn billions to horrors beyond comprehension. But that is what happened. And now, in the years that have followed, as I sit in a larger office with a better view and a promotion I never wanted, I understand that the Imperium's greatest catastrophes do not always announce themselves with gunfire or the roar of warp engines. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a correctly filed report, a procedural escalation, a flag raised by a clerk who was only trying to meet his quota. This is the story of how I did everything right, and how that destroyed everything. The day it began was unremarkable in every conceivable way. The station's artificial dawn had cycled through its gradual illumination sequence, pulling me from shallow sleep in my habitation cell, a space barely large enough for a cot and a small shrine to the God Emperor. I dressed in the same grey robes I wore every day, their fabric worn thin at the elbows and knees, and made my way through corridors lined with pipes and conduits that hissed and gurgled like the digestive tract of some immense beast. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and machine oil, a scent so familiar I no longer noticed it except when I returned from a rare surface leave and had to readjust. I passed servitors in their alcoves, their augmented bodies locked in maintenance postures, their eyes vacant or replaced entirely by sensor lenses that tracked movement without curiosity. I nodded to a few fellow adepts, men and women whose names I knew, but whose lives remained mysteries to me, and received the same half-hearted gestures in return. We were not friends, we were cogs, and cogs do not befriend one another. My workstation was located in Hall 14, Row 83, Position 12, a desk identical to the hundreds of others arranged in perfect columns beneath vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow. The hall was vast enough that conversations became inaudible beyond a dozen meters, swallowed by the sheer volume of space and the constant background hum of machinery. I settled into my chair, its cushion long since compressed into a shape that matched my spine, and activated my cogitator terminal. The screen flickered to life, displaying the same interface I had stared at for the past 8 years, a grid of data fields and status indicators that would dictate the course of my day. I logged in with my personal cipher, a sequence of 17 characters I had memorized so thoroughly that my fingers moved through it without conscious thought, and waited as the system retrieved my assigned workload. 347 compliance reports awaited verification. The number was high, even for me, a consequence of the Indomitus Crusade's relentless expansion into regions of space that had been cut off from the Astronomicon for millennia. Every world reclaimed, every population brought back into the fold, generated paperwork that flowed upward through the Administratum's hierarchy like blood through veins, and it was my job to ensure that the tithe assessments, population counts, and resource allocations matched the expected parameters. I began with the first report, a mining colony in the Gaia Reach that had submitted its quarterly production figures 3 days late. The delay was minor, well within acceptable margins, but protocol required that I note it in the file and forward a reminder to the planetary governor. I did so, my fingers moving across the keypad with the mechanical precision of long practice, and moved to the next. A hive world in the Caledon sector had reported a population decrease of 2% due to plague, a figure that required cross-referencing with Medicaid records and ecclesiarchy death rites to verify authenticity. The numbers aligned. I approved the report. The next was a feral world petition for reclassification based on recent technological uplifts introduced by visiting Mechanicus priests, a request that would require review by a senior adept and was therefore outside my purview. I flagged it for escalation and continued. The work was tedious, mind-numbing in its repetition, but I took a strange comfort in it. In a galaxy where uncertainty was the only constant, where worlds burned and empires rose and fell in the span of a heartbeat, there was something reassuring about the orderly progression of data, the knowledge that each report represented a small piece of the Imperium's vast machinery functioning as intended. Hours passed. I paused only to sip from a cup of recaf that had gone cold, its bitter taste barely registering as I swallowed. Around me, the hall hummed with the activity of hundreds of other adepts, each absorbed in their own work, each contributing to the endless processing of information that kept the Imperium alive. I thought of us as priests of a sort, though I would never have said so aloud. We did not wield weapons or command fleets, but we served the Emperor in our own way, maintaining the systems that allowed his armies to march and his worlds to prosper. It was humble work, but it was necessary work, and I had long ago made peace with the fact that my contributions would never be celebrated or even acknowledged. I was content to be forgotten, to serve in obscurity until age or infirmity rendered me unfit, at which point I would be quietly retired and replaced by another adept who would sit in the same chair and perform the same functions. That was the way of the Administratum. That was the way of the Imperium. The report that changed everything appeared on my screen at approximately hour 6 of my shift. It was nestled among a cluster of agricultural assessments, a routine tithe compliance check for a world designated Calith's Rest, located in the Varan subsector near the edges of mapped space. The planet's classification was listed as Agri-World, population grade, Tertius, with a modest tithe obligation of grain, livestock, and vegetable matter sufficient to supply a modest fleet anchorage and several nearby garrison worlds. According to the file, Calith's Rest had been rediscovered 12 years prior during the initial waves of the Indomitus Crusade, its population having maintained a semblance of imperial culture despite millennia of isolation. The world had been quietly folded back into the Administratum's records, its tithes assessed and collected without incident. Until now, the most recent tithe shipment, scheduled to depart 18 months prior, had not arrived. There was no accompanying explanation, no communique from the planetary governor, no distress beacon or request for extension. Just silence. I frowned at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keypad. Delayed tithes were not uncommon, particularly from worlds in the process of reintegration, but the absence of any communication was irregular. Protocol dictated that I flag the file for follow-up, a simple matter of sending an inquiry to the local Administratum liaison and requesting clarification. But as I reviewed the file more closely, I noticed another irregularity. The tithe assessment itself was anomalous, far lower than what a world of Calith's Rest's reported size and productivity should have been expected to provide. The figures suggested either gross incompetence in the initial survey or deliberate underreporting, both of which were violations of imperial law. And there was something else, a note buried in the file's metadata that caught my attention. The assessment had been flagged as provisional, subject to review and adjustment within a 5-year period, but that review had never been conducted. The world had simply been allowed to exist in a state of limbo, neither fully compliant nor fully delinquent, for over a decade. I should have moved on. I should have filed the inquiry and let the matter progress through the proper channels, trusting that someone further up the chain of command would address the issue if it warranted attention. But I was behind on my quota. The 347 reports on my docket were expected to be processed by the end of the week, and I was already falling behind schedule due to the complexity of several files that had required extensive cross-referencing. If I filed a simple inquiry, it would take weeks or even months to receive a response, during which time the file would remain open on my docket, dragging down my performance metrics and potentially impacting my annual review. But if I escalated the matter, If I flagged Calith's Rest as non-compliant and triggered an automatic audit protocol, the file would be removed from my docket immediately and transferred to a higher authority. My quota would be met, my metrics would improve, and I could move on to the next report without delay. It was a decision born entirely of administrative convenience, a shortcut that would save me a few hours of work and keep my record clean. I did not think of the consequences. I did not consider what an audit might entail for the people of Calith's Rest, or what the lack of communication might signify. I simply saw an opportunity to meet my quota and took it. I flagged the file. The system acknowledged my input with a soft chime, and the file disappeared from my screen, transferred to the Escalation Processing Division for review. I felt a small measure of relief, the kind that comes from checking off a task and moving forward, and returned my attention to the next report. I did not think about Calith's Rest again for the rest of the day. It took 3 days for the first response to arrive. A terse message from a senior adept in the Escalation Processing Division informing me that my flag had been reviewed and deemed valid. An audit team would be dispatched to Calith's Rest to investigate the delayed tithe and reassess the world's compliance status. The message included a commendation for my diligence, a small notation that would be added to my personnel file and might, in some distant future, contribute to a minor promotion or salary increase. I read the message with mild satisfaction, pleased that my judgment had been vindicated, and filed it away. The matter was out of my hands now, and I returned to my work with the knowledge that I had done my duty. The second response arrived 6 days later, and it was not a message, but a summons. I was called to the office of Magister Prefect Yalen Kaur, a senior administrator whose domain encompassed the entire Compliance Verification Division and whose attention I had never before warranted. The summons was delivered by a servo skull, its parchment clutched in skeletal fingers, and the wording was formal and terse, instructing me to present myself at the Magister Prefect's chambers within the hour. I felt a flicker of unease as I read it, a cold prickling at the base of my skull that I could not quite explain. Summons from senior administrators were rare, and they seldom boded well for those who received them. I wondered if I had made an error, if my flag of Calith's Rest had been premature, or if some aspect of the file had been misinterpreted, but I could not see what I might have done wrong. I had followed protocol to the letter, acted within the scope of my authority, and ensured that all relevant data had been included in my escalation. If there was a problem, it was not of my making. I made my way to the Magister Prefect's chambers through corridors I had never before traversed, ascending through levels of the station reserved for senior personnel. The architecture here was different, less utilitarian and more ornate, with walls adorned by frescoes depicting scenes of imperial triumph and purity seals hanging from archways like the shed skins of serpents. The air was cooler, cleaner, filtered through systems that removed not just impurities, but also the scent of human occupation. I passed servitors that were more advanced than those in the lower levels, their augmentations seamless and their movements fluid, almost lifelike. I passed other adepts dressed in robes of finer fabric, their expressions distant and preoccupied, their gazes sliding over me as though I were a ghost. I felt out of place here, a creature from the lower depths intruding upon a realm that was not meant for me, and I quickened my pace, eager to complete whatever business awaited me and return to the familiar confines of Hall 14. The Magister Prefect's chambers were located at the end of a long corridor, their entrance marked by a pair of heavy doors inlaid with gold and inscribed with passages from the Tactica Imperium. I announced myself to the servitor standing guard, a hulking figure whose torso had been replaced almost entirely by armor plating and whose arms ended in weapons that were currently powered down but no less intimidating for it. The servitor scanned me with a sensor array built into its skull, confirming my identity, and the doors opened with a hiss of pneumatic pressure. I stepped inside. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with shelves that held thousands of data slates and scrolls. A single desk dominated the center of the room, its surface polished to a mirror sheen and covered with stacks of parchment arranged in perfect order. Behind the desk sat Magister Prefect Kaur, a woman of indeterminate age whose features had been preserved by Juvenat treatments and whose eyes were augmented with bionic lenses that clicked and whirred as they focused on me. She did not rise as I entered, nor did she gesture for me to sit. She simply watched me, her expression unreadable, as I crossed the chamber and stopped before her desk. I bowed, as protocol dictated, and waited for her to speak. She did not speak for a long time. The silence stretched, oppressive and heavy, and I felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing pressing against my chest. Finally, she leaned forward, her augmented eyes clicking as they adjusted, and spoke in a voice that was soft but carried the unmistakable authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. "You are Adept Inspector Halrix Morn." "Yes, Magister Prefect." "You flagged the world Calith's Rest for non-compliance and triggered an automatic audit protocol." "Yes, Magister Prefect." "The tithe shipment was delayed, and the assessment figures were anomalous." I believed escalation was warranted. She nodded slowly, her expression still unreadable. "Your judgment was correct, Adept Inspector. The audit team has confirmed significant irregularities in Calith's Rest's compliance record. The world has been operating under provisional status for over a decade without proper oversight, a failure that reflects poorly on the division as a whole. Your diligence in identifying this lapse is commendable." I felt a flicker of relief, the tension in my chest easing slightly. "Thank you, Magister Prefect. However," she continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, "the situation has become more complicated than initially anticipated. The audit team's arrival at Calith's Rest has revealed irregularities far beyond delayed tithes or underreported assessments. The world has been operating under what appears to be a deliberate information blackout, maintained by parties unknown and for purposes that remain unclear. The Administratum liaison assigned to the world has not responded to our inquiries, and attempts to establish communication with the planetary governor have been unsuccessful. In light of these findings, the matter has been escalated to the Sector Command, and additional assets are being deployed to investigate." I frowned, confusion replacing relief. "Additional assets, Magister Prefect?" "Naval and military assets," she clarified. "A patrol fleet has been rerouted to the Varan subsector to secure the system and conduct a full investigation. Depending on what they find, further action may be required." The unease returned, sharper now, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I did not understand why my simple flag had escalated to the deployment of a fleet, but I sensed that the explanation would not be comforting. I hesitated, then asked, "Is there something unusual about Calith's Rest, Magister Prefect? Something that was not included in the file?" Her augmented eyes clicked again, refocusing, and for a moment I thought I saw something in her expression, a flicker of concern or perhaps calculation. "That is what we are attempting to determine, Adept Inspector. The world's records are incomplete, its initial rediscovery poorly documented, and there are gaps in the data that suggest either negligence or deliberate obfuscation. Your flag has brought these issues to light, and for that, you are to be commended. However, I must impress upon you the importance of discretion in this matter. The investigation is ongoing, and any premature disclosure of its details could compromise operational security. You are not to discuss Calith's Rest with your colleagues, and you are to refer any inquiries to my office directly. Is that understood?" "Yes, Magister Prefect," she nodded, leaning back in her chair. "You are dismissed, Adept Inspector. Return to your duties and continue to perform them with the same diligence you have demonstrated thus far. You will be notified if your involvement in this matter is required again." I bowed again, turned, and left the chamber, the heavy doors closing behind me with a finality that felt like the sealing of a tomb. The days that followed were marked by a growing sense of disquiet that I could not shake, a low-frequency hum of anxiety that followed me through my waking hours and invaded my sleep. I tried to focus on my work, to lose myself in the routine of processing reports and verifying data, but my mind kept returning to Calith's Rest and the Magister Prefect's words. There was something unusual about the world, something that had warranted the deployment of a fleet, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew. The file I had reviewed had been sparse, almost deliberately so, lacking the detailed surveys and historical context that typically accompanied world assessments. I had assumed this was simply a consequence of the world's recent rediscovery, a gap that would be filled in time. But now I wondered if the gaps had been intentional, if someone had taken care to ensure that certain information remained hidden. I wanted to investigate further, to search the Administratum's archives for additional files or records that might shed light on the world's history. But the Magister Prefect's warning about discretion held me back. I did not want to risk drawing attention to myself, did not want to be seen as overstepping my authority or meddling in matters beyond my remit, and so I waited, checking my terminal each day for updates or new instructions, and found none. The matter had moved beyond me, absorbed into the vast machinery of the Administratum's higher echelons, and I was left to wonder what was happening in the Varan subsector and whether my flag had set something irrevocable into motion. The first reports began to filter down 3 weeks later, not through official channels but through the informal networks of gossip and rumor that permeated every level of the Administratum. I heard whispers in the habitation corridors, fragments of conversation overheard in the refectories, and saw the furtive glances of my colleagues as they discussed matters they were not supposed to know. The patrol fleet dispatched to Calith's Rest had arrived in the system and established orbit around the world, but their attempts to make contact with the surface had been met with silence. No transmissions, no signals, no signs of life. The fleet's commander had dispatched landing parties to investigate, and what they found had prompted an immediate request for reinforcements. The world was not deserted, but it was not normal either. Something was wrong, something that required military intervention, and the details were being kept under the strictest secrecy. I tried to ignore the rumors, to dismiss them as the exaggerations and distortions that inevitably accompanied any event of significance, but I could not. I had flagged the world, I had set this chain of events into motion, and now, as the situation escalated, I felt a growing sense of responsibility mingled with dread. What had I uncovered? What had been hidden on Calith's Rest, and why? The answers came 6 weeks after my initial flag, delivered not as a message or a summons, but as a data packet transmitted directly to my terminal. The packet was marked with the highest security clearance, its contents accessible only to those with explicit authorization, but it had been sent to me by the Magister Prefect's office with instructions to review it and report my findings. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart pounding in my chest, and began to read. The file contained the full report from the fleet's investigation, a document so dense with technical jargon and military terminology that I had to read it twice to understand its implications. The landing parties had found Calith's Rest to be a world in stasis, its population alive but unresponsive, locked in a state of suspended animation that defied conventional explanation. The cities were intact, their streets and buildings undamaged, but they were empty, devoid of activity or sound. The fields were untended, the livestock wandering aimlessly, and the infrastructure that should have supported a functioning society had fallen into disrepair. It was as though the entire world had simply stopped, frozen in place by some invisible force. The investigation had uncovered the source of the stasis, a vast underground complex hidden beneath the planet's northern continent. The complex was ancient, predating the Imperium's arrival by millennia, and it contained technology that the Mechanicus had identified as Xenos in origin, though the specific species could not be determined. The technology was still active, generating a field that enveloped the planet and suppressed all higher brain function in its inhabitants, rendering them catatonic but alive. The field was self-sustaining, powered by some unknown energy source, and its purpose was unclear. What was clear, however, was that the field had been deliberately activated, and that its activation had been timed to coincide with Calith's Rest's reintegration into the Imperium. The report went on to detail the fleet's attempts to deactivate the field, efforts that had proven unsuccessful and had resulted in the deaths of several Mechanicus adepts who had ventured too close to the complex's core. The technology was beyond their understanding, its mechanisms alien and incomprehensible, and every attempt to shut it down had only strengthened its output. The fleet's commander had made the decision to withdraw and request assistance from the Inquisition, a decision that had been approved by Sector Command and was now being implemented. An inquisitorial delegation was en route to Calith's Rest, their arrival expected within the month. But that was not the worst of it. The final section of the report contained an addendum, a note appended by an unnamed analyst within the Administratum's Threat Assessment Bureau. The note was brief, its language clinical and detached, but its content sent a chill through my bones. According to the analyst, Calith's Rest had not been rediscovered by accident. The world had been deliberately omitted from Imperial records for centuries, its existence known only to a select few within the highest levels of the Administratum and the Inquisition. The world's isolation had been maintained as part of a containment strategy, a plan designed to keep the Xenos technology dormant and prevent its discovery by parties who might seek to exploit it. The plan had been in place since the end of the Great Crusade, maintained through the careful manipulation of records and the suppression of any information that might lead to the world's rediscovery. It had worked for 10,000 years, preserving the galaxy from whatever threat the technology represented, until the Indomitus Crusade had swept through the region and brought Calith's Rest back into the fold. My flag had shattered that containment. By escalating the world's non-compliance, I had drawn attention to a planet that was supposed to remain forgotten, and the resulting investigation had activated the very threat the containment strategy had been designed to prevent. The Xenos technology, dormant for millennia, had awakened in response to the Imperial presence, and its activation had triggered a cascade of consequences that were only beginning to unfold. I sat in my chair, staring at the screen, my mind struggling to process the enormity of what I had just read. I had done everything right. I had followed protocol, acted within my authority, and identified a legitimate compliance issue. And in doing so, I had undone a plan that had preserved an entire subsector for 10,000 years. The dread that had been building within me since my meeting with the Magister Prefect crystallized into something sharper, a cold and visceral terror that made it difficult to breathe. I wanted to believe that this was not my fault, that the responsibility lay with those who had failed to mark the world as restricted or who had allowed it to be rediscovered in the first place. But I could not escape the truth. My flag had been the catalyst. My decision, born of nothing more than a desire to meet my quota and streamline my workload, had set this disaster into motion, and the disaster was only just beginning. The inquisitorial delegation arrived 4 weeks later, their ship dropping out of the warp at the edge of the Varan subsector and making its way to Calith's Rest with a speed that suggested urgency. The delegation was led by Inquisitor Valeska Thorn, a woman whose reputation preceded her, a hunter of Xenos threats, and a zealot whose methods were as ruthless as they were effective. She brought with her a retinue of agents, acolytes, and specialists, as well as a detachment of Adeptus Astartes from the Silver Templars chapter, warriors whose presence indicated the seriousness with which the Inquisition regarded the situation. The fleet in orbit around Calith's Rest was placed under her command, and she immediately ordered a cordon established around the planet, prohibiting any further landings or transmissions until the threat could be properly assessed. I learned of her arrival through official channels, a brief communiqué sent to all personnel involved in the Calith's Rest investigation, informing us that the matter had been transferred to inquisitorial authority and that we were to provide any requested support. The communiqué included no details, no explanation of what Inquisitor Thorn intended to do or what her assessment of the situation might be. It was simply a notification, a formality that acknowledged our involvement while making it clear that we were no longer in control. I returned to my work, trying to focus on the reports that continued to accumulate on my terminal, but I found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. My thoughts kept returning to Calith's Rest, to the people trapped in their catatonic state, and the Xenos technology that held them prisoner. I wondered what the Inquisitor would decide, whether she would attempt to save the world or whether she would simply destroy it, erasing the threat and the evidence in a single orbital bombardment. I wondered if anyone would mourn the loss, if anyone even knew the names of the people who lived there. They had been forgotten once, deliberately omitted from Imperial records, and I feared that they would be forgotten again, their deaths recorded as nothing more than a footnote in some classified file. The weeks that followed were marked by a tense silence, a holding pattern in which nothing seemed to happen, and yet everything felt poised on the edge of collapse. I heard no further updates, saw no new communiques, and the rumors that had circulated through the station died down as attention shifted to other matters. It was as though Calith's Rest had ceased to exist, swallowed by the black hole of inquisitorial secrecy, and I began to wonder if the matter had been resolved, if Inquisitor Thorn had found a way to deactivate the Xenos technology and save the world's population. I wanted to believe that, wanted to cling to the hope that my flag had not resulted in unmitigated disaster, but I could not shake the feeling that something terrible was still unfolding, hidden from view. The truth arrived quietly, delivered not as an official report but as a single line of text appended to a routine casualty assessment. The assessment was for the Varan subsector, a quarterly summary of losses incurred by Imperial forces in the region, and it included a notation for Calith's Rest. The world had been declared perditus, lost to the Imperium. Its population recorded as casualties. The number was staggering. 4 billion souls, gone in an instant. No explanation was provided, no details of what had happened or why, just the cold finality of a world struck from the records. I stared at the screen, my hands frozen on the keypad, my mind unable to process the enormity of what I was reading. 4 billion. An entire world. Gone. I wanted to believe that it had been necessary, that Inquisitor Thorn had made the only decision possible in the face of an insurmountable threat, but I could not. I knew, with a certainty that cut deeper than any blade, that this was my fault. My flag had brought the Imperium to Calith's Rest. My flag had awakened the Xenos technology. My flag had doomed 4 billion people to death, and I had been praised for it. The days that followed the casualty report's release were a blur, a disjointed sequence of events that I experienced as though from a great distance. I went through the motions of my work, processing reports and verifying data with the same mechanical precision I had always employed, but I felt hollow, gutted, as though some essential part of me had been carved away and replaced with emptiness. I could not stop thinking about Calith's Rest, about the people who had died there, about the fact that their deaths had been the direct result of my actions. I told myself that I had only been doing my job, that I had followed protocol and acted with the information available to me. But it did not matter. The guilt was a weight that pressed down on me, suffocating and inescapable. I considered resigning, submitting a formal request for reassignment or retirement, but I did not. What would it accomplish? The Administratum would simply replace me with another adept, and the work would continue. The Imperium was vast beyond comprehension, its machinery indifferent to the suffering of individuals, and my departure would not change that. I was a cog, and cogs did not retire. They simply wore down until they broke. And then, 3 months after the casualty report, I received another summons from Magister Prefect Corps. This time, I felt no unease, no flicker of anxiety. I felt nothing at all. I made my way to her chambers with the same detached sense of unreality that had characterized my existence since learning of Calith's Rest's fate. The corridors seemed longer, the air colder, and the ornate decorations that had once seemed impressive now felt like the trappings of a mausoleum. I entered her chambers, bowed as protocol dictated, and waited for her to speak. "Adept Inspector Morn," she began, her augmented eyes clicking as they focused on me. "You have been commended for your exemplary service in the matter of Calith's Rest. Your diligence in identifying compliance irregularities and your adherence to proper escalation protocols have been noted by Sector Command, and it is my pleasure to inform you that you have been promoted to Adept Inspector 2nd Class, effective immediately. Your new posting will be in the Regional Oversight Bureau, a position that carries greater responsibility and authority. You should be proud, Adept Inspector. Your actions have upheld the highest standards of the Administratum." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process her words. Promoted, commended, proud. The terms felt alien, as though she was speaking a language I no longer understood. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell her that I did not want the promotion, that I did not deserve it, but the words would not come. What could I say? That I had doomed a world? That I had destroyed a plan 10,000 years in the making? that I was responsible for the deaths of 4 billion people. She would not understand. She would see only what the Imperium saw, a clerk who had done his duty and been rewarded for it, and so I said nothing. I simply nodded, accepted the promotion, and left the chamber. The weeks that followed my promotion were marked by a deepening numbness, a disconnection from the world around me that made everything feel distant and unreal. I moved to my new posting, a larger office with a better view, and a staff of junior adepts who looked to me for guidance, and I performed my new duties with the same mechanical precision I had always employed. But I felt like a ghost, a hollow shell moving through the motions of life without truly inhabiting it. I could not shake the image of Calith's Rest, the planet hanging in the void like a grave marker, its surface silent and empty. I dreamed of it at night, visions of cities frozen in time and people locked in eternal stillness, and I woke each morning with the weight of their deaths pressing down on me like a shroud. I searched the archives, driven by a need to understand what had happened, to piece together the full story of Calith's Rest and the containment strategy that had been shattered. What I found was fragmentary, incomplete, but it painted a picture that was even more damning than I had imagined. The Xenos technology buried beneath Calith's Rest had been discovered during the Great Crusade, identified as a weapon of the Aeldari, a device designed to suppress warp activity in a localized region of space. The device had been left dormant, its creators long since departed, and the Imperium had recognized its potential value as a bulwark against chaos incursion. Rather than destroy it, they had chosen to leave it in place, concealing its existence and ensuring that the world remained isolated. The plan had worked for 10 millennia, keeping the device hidden and inactive, until the Indomitus Crusade had brought the world back into the fold, and my flag had drawn attention to it. But the device had not simply awakened. It had been triggered by the Imperial presence, activated by some fail-safe mechanism designed to protect it from discovery. And its activation had done more than render the population catatonic. It had torn a rift in the fabric of reality, a wound in the warp that grew larger with each passing day. The rift was small at first, barely noticeable, but it was expanding, fed by the psychic energy of the planet's trapped inhabitants and the ambient warp turbulence of the region. Inquisitor Thorn had recognized the danger immediately, understood that the rift would eventually consume the entire subsector if left unchecked, and she had made the only decision she could. She had ordered an exterminatus, a planetary bombardment that reduced Calith's Rest to ash and sealed the rift before it could grow beyond control. 4 billion lives sacrificed to prevent a greater catastrophe. A catastrophe that would never have occurred if I had not flagged the world in the first place. The full scope of the disaster became clear in the months that followed, as reports filtered in from neighboring systems and the Administratum conducted a comprehensive review of the Varan subsector's stability. The rift had not been completely sealed. Fragments of it remained, scattered across the subsector like shards of broken glass, each one a potential gateway for warp entities to enter real space. The Navy had been forced to establish a permanent cordon around the region, diverting ships and resources from other theaters of war, and the Inquisition had dispatched additional teams to hunt down and eliminate any chaos incursions that might emerge from the rift fragments. The cost in lives and materiel was staggering, a burden that the subsector would bear for decades if not centuries, and all of it could be traced back to a single moment, a single decision made by a clerk who was only trying to meet his quota. I read the reports with a detached sense of horror, the numbers blurring together into a litany of suffering that I could not fully comprehend. Billions displaced, thousands dead in skirmishes with chaos warbands, entire systems placed under quarantine, and at the center of it all, a single world that had been deliberately forgotten, its existence concealed to protect the galaxy from a threat it did not know existed. A world I had rediscovered with a flag and a keystroke. The Administratum, for its part, viewed the matter as a success. The Magister Prefect's office issued a commendation for the entire Compliance Verification Division, praising our diligence in identifying and addressing compliance irregularities even in the most challenging circumstances. My name was mentioned specifically, held up as an example of the kind of dedication and attention to detail that kept the Imperium functioning. I was invited to speak at a divisional assembly, to share my insights and experiences with my colleagues, and I declined, citing the demands of my new position. But the truth was that I could not bear to stand before them and be celebrated for what I had done. I could not bear to see their admiration, their envy, their belief that I had achieved something worthy of recognition, because I knew the truth. I knew that the Imperium's greatest disasters were not always the result of malice or incompetence, but of diligence, of correct procedures applied in the wrong place at the wrong time. I knew that the machinery we served was so vast, so complex, that no single person could see the full picture, that even the most well-intentioned actions could have consequences that cascaded outward like ripples in a pond, growing larger and more destructive with each passing moment. I knew that I had been a faithful cog in that machinery, and that my faithfulness had doomed billions, and I knew that the Imperium did not care. It would continue to function, continue to expand, continue to consume worlds and lives in its endless hunger for survival. My promotion was proof of that. The commendations, the praise, the quiet satisfaction of my superiors. They saw only a clerk who had done his job, who had identified a problem and escalated it through proper channels. They did not see the 4 billion dead, the shattered containment strategy, the decades of instability that would plague the Varan subsector, or perhaps they did see it, and simply did not consider it a failure. Perhaps, to them, the loss of one world was an acceptable price to pay for maintaining the Administratum's standards and procedures. Perhaps the plan had been doomed from the start, its secrecy too fragile to survive the relentless march of bureaucracy. I wanted to believe that there was someone to blame, some individual or group whose negligence or malice had created the conditions for disaster. But the more I learned, the more I understood that there was no villain in this story, no shadowy conspirator pulling strings behind the scenes. There was only the Imperium, vast and indifferent, and the millions of clerks and adepts and officials who kept it running, each one performing their small function without ever seeing the whole. I had been one of those clerks, and I had performed my function flawlessly, and that was the tragedy. The years have passed since Calith's Rest was destroyed, and I have continued to rise through the ranks of the Administratum, each promotion a reminder of the price I paid to get here. I sit now in an office far removed from the cramped confines of Hall 14, with a window that overlooks the void and a staff of adepts who look to me for guidance. I process reports of a different kind now, assessments and summaries that deal in abstractions and aggregates, numbers so large they lose all meaning. I no longer see the individual worlds, the individual lives that make up those numbers. I see only data, patterns, trends. It is easier that way. Easier to function without the weight of individual tragedies pressing down on me. But I still dream of Calith's Rest. I dream of the cities frozen in time, the people locked in eternal stillness, the rift tearing through the sky like a wound in the flesh of reality. I dream of the moment I flagged the file, the soft chime of the cogitator acknowledging my input, the relief I felt as the file disappeared from my screen, and I wake each morning with the knowledge that I will never escape what I have done, that the ghosts of 4 billion souls will follow me for the rest of my life. I have tried to find meaning in it, to convince myself that there was a lesson to be learned, some higher purpose that justifies the suffering. But there is no lesson, there is only the truth, cold and unyielding, that the Imperium is a machine, and machines do not forgive mistakes. They do not recognize intent or context or circumstance. They simply function, grinding forward with relentless momentum, and those who serve them are either crushed beneath the gears or lifted up by them. I was lifted up, elevated to positions of greater authority and responsibility, and I will carry the weight of that elevation for as long as I live. The irony is not lost on me. I was promoted for doing everything right, for following the rules and upholding the standards that keep the Imperium functioning. And in doing so, I became complicit in a system that values procedure over people, that sees worlds as nothing more than entries in a ledger to be flagged and escalated and resolved without regard for the lives they contain. I am no longer just a cog in the machine. I am part of the mechanism itself, a component of the vast and terrible engine that devours everything in its path. And I cannot leave, cannot resign, cannot escape, because to do so would be to admit that the system is broken, and the Imperium does not tolerate such admissions. And so I continue. I process my reports, I sign my authorizations, I issue my directives, and I watch as the numbers climb higher and higher, each one representing a world, a system, a life that has been consumed by the machine. I tell myself that I am serving the Emperor, that I am doing my duty, that the Imperium would not function without people like me. But I know the truth. I know that I am a monster, not because I intended harm, but because I chose efficiency over empathy, procedure over compassion. I know that the Administratum is filled with monsters like me, men and women who perform their functions with diligence and precision and never once stop to consider the consequences of their actions. And I know that this is how the Imperium survives, by grinding forward without pause, without reflection, without mercy. There are moments, rare and fleeting, when I allow myself to wonder what would have happened if I had made a different choice. If I had filed a simple inquiry instead of escalating the matter, if I had taken the time to investigate further, to search for the missing context that might have revealed Calith's Rest's true nature, if I had simply moved on to the next report and let the world remain forgotten, would the containment strategy have held? Would the 4 billion people of Calith's Rest still be alive, their world hidden in the shadows where it belonged? Or would the disaster have unfolded anyway, triggered by some other clerk in some other division who made the same decision I did? I will never know, and that uncertainty is perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. The knowledge that my guilt may be justified, or it may be meaningless, that I may be the architect of a catastrophe, or simply the unfortunate catalyst for something that was always going to happen. The Imperium does not allow for clarity, does not offer the comfort of certainty. It simply grinds forward, and we are left to make sense of the wreckage in its wake. I have stopped trying to make sense of it. I have stopped trying to find redemption, or absolution, or any kind of peace. I have accepted that I will carry the weight of Calith's Rest for the rest of my life, that I will wake each morning with the ghosts of 4 billion souls pressing down on me, and that I will continue to serve the Imperium because there is nothing else I know how to do. I am a clerk, a functionary, a cog in the machine, and cogs do not retire, they simply wear down until they break. But I will not forget. I will not allow the memory of Calith's Rest to fade, to be swallowed by the black hole of bureaucracy and secrecy that consumes so much of the Imperium's history. I will carry it with me, a wound that never heals, a reminder of what happens when procedure and protocol are allowed to override compassion and context. I will carry it as a warning, though I know the warning will never be heeded, that the machine will continue to grind forward regardless of what I or anyone else might say, because that is the nature of the Imperium. It does not learn. It does not adapt, it simply endures, consuming everything in its path, and the best we can hope for is that we are not crushed beneath its wheels. I was never meant to be remembered, but I will remember. For as long as I live, I will remember Calith's Rest and the 4 billion souls I condemned with a keystroke. The inquisitorial reports continue to come in, sporadic and heavily redacted, but they paint a picture of ongoing instability in the Varren subsector. The rift fragments have proven more resilient than anticipated, their presence warping the local warp currents and creating navigational hazards that have isolated several systems. Chaos warbands have taken advantage of the disorder, launching raids against vulnerable worlds and establishing footholds in regions that were once firmly under Imperial control. The Navy's cordon holds, but it is stretched thin, and there are whispers that the Inquisition is considering more drastic measures, perhaps even declaring the entire subsector perditus and withdrawing Imperial forces to more defensible positions. If that happens, millions more will die, their worlds abandoned to the predations of Chaos and Xenos alike, and all of it will trace back to that single moment, that single flag, that single decision made by a clerk who was only trying to meet his quota. I think about that often, The cascading consequences of a single action, the way a small pebble can trigger an avalanche. I think about the millions of other clerks and adepts and officials throughout the Imperium, each one making similar decisions every day, each one processing reports and flagging files and escalating matters through proper channels. How many of them have triggered disasters they will never know about? How many have condemned worlds with a keystroke, their actions lost in the vast machinery of bureaucracy? How many sleep soundly at night, unaware of the suffering they have caused? I used to believe that the Administratum was necessary, that its rigid structures and procedures were the foundation upon which the Imperium stood. I believed that without us, without the millions of clerks who maintained the flow of information and resources, the entire edifice would collapse. And perhaps that is still true. Perhaps the Imperium cannot survive without the machinery that grinds forward with relentless momentum, consuming worlds and lives in the name of order and stability. But I no longer believe that this is a good thing. I no longer believe that the price we pay is justified by the survival it purchases. I have seen the cost firsthand, felt its weight pressing down on me, and I know that there must be a better way. But I also know that the Imperium will never find it, that its momentum is too great, its inertia too powerful to be redirected. And so we will continue as we always have, grinding forward, consuming everything in our path, until there is nothing left but ash and ruin. There are days when I consider speaking out, filing a report of my own that details what happened on Calith's Rest and the failures that led to its destruction. I imagine the words I would write, the evidence I would compile, the arguments I would make. I imagine submitting the report and watching it disappear into the machinery, processed and filed and forgotten like every other report that challenges the status quo. And then I imagine the consequences, the quiet removal from my post, the reassignment to some remote outpost where I would be unable to cause further disruption. Or perhaps something worse, a quiet disappearance, my name struck from the records as though I had never existed. The Imperium does not tolerate dissent, does not allow for criticism or introspection. It demands obedience, and those who question its methods are quickly silenced. And so I remain silent. I continue to process my reports, to sign my authorizations, to perform my function with the same diligence and precision that earned me my promotion. I tell myself that I am biding my time, waiting for an opportunity to make a difference, but I know the truth. I am afraid of the consequences, afraid of the machinery, afraid of what will happen if I step out of line, and so I remain complicit, a willing participant in a system I know to be broken, and I live with the knowledge that I am a coward as well as a monster. But I will not forget. I will carry the memory of Calith's Rest with me, a wound that never heals, a reminder of what I have done and what I have become, and perhaps, in some small way, that is enough. Perhaps the act of remembering, of refusing to let the dead be forgotten, is the only resistance I am capable of. Perhaps it is the only thing that separates me from the machinery, the only proof that I am still human despite everything I have done. I do not know. I will never know, but I will remember. The most recent report crossed my desk yesterday, a casualty assessment for the Varan subsector covering the last fiscal quarter. The numbers are staggering, even by the Imperium's grim standards. 200 million dead in combat operations, 500 million displaced by chaos raids, 15 worlds placed under quarantine, their populations condemned to slow death by starvation or disease. And at the bottom of the report, a single line that caught my eye. Causative factors remain under investigation by the Inquisition. No further details, no explanation. Just that single line acknowledging that someone, somewhere, is trying to understand how it all went wrong. I wonder if they will ever trace it back to me, if they will ever uncover the chain of events that began with a flag and ended with the destruction of an entire subsector. I wonder if my name will appear in their reports, if I will be identified as the catalyst for this disaster. But I know the answer. They will not find me. The machinery is too vast, the connections too diffuse, the chain of causation too complex. They will find scapegoats, individuals and groups who can be blamed and punished, and the system itself will remain untouched, its flaws unacknowledged and unaddressed. and I will continue to rise, promoted and commended for my diligence, my name spoken with respect by those who do not know what I have done, and I will carry the weight of it for the rest of my life. There is no redemption in this story, no moment of revelation or catharsis that offers relief from the burden of guilt. There is only the grinding forward of the machine, the relentless momentum of the Imperium, and the knowledge that I am a part of it, a component that functions as designed. I have learned that the greatest horrors are not always the result of malice or cruelty, but of diligence, of adherence to procedure, of correct decisions made in the wrong context. I have learned that the Imperium does not punish its monsters. It rewards them, elevating them to positions of greater authority so that they can continue to perform their functions with ever greater efficiency. And I have learned that there is no escape, no resignation, no way out except through the slow erosion of time and the eventual collapse of the system itself. But until that collapse comes, I will continue. I will process my reports, I will sign my authorizations, I will perform my function, and I will remember Calith's rest, and the 4 billion souls I condemned with a keystroke. I will remember because someone must, because the Imperium will not, because the machinery has no memory and no conscience. I will remember as an act of penance, as an acknowledgement of my guilt, as the only resistance I am capable of. And perhaps, in the end, that will be enough. Perhaps the act of bearing witness, of refusing to let the dead be forgotten, is the only way to preserve some fragment of humanity in a system that devours everything it touches. Perhaps it is the only thing that separates us from the machine, the only proof that we are more than cogs and gears and components. I do not know, I will never know, but I will remember, because I was never meant to be remembered. But they were. The 4 billion souls of Calith's rest, the countless millions who have died in the subsector's collapse, the untold billions who will die in the centuries to come as the consequences of my actions ripple outward through the galaxy. They deserve to be remembered, to be more than numbers in a report, to be recognized as lives that mattered even if the Imperium does not care. And so I carry their memory, a burden I did not choose but cannot refuse, a weight that grows heavier with each passing day. This is my story. This is my confession. This is the truth of what happened on Calith's rest and the price that was paid for my diligence. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not expect understanding. I expect nothing, because the Imperium offers nothing except the grinding forward of the machine. But I will speak, and I will remember, and I will carry the weight of what I have done for as long as I live. And when I die, when the machinery finally breaks me and casts me aside, I hope that someone else will remember. I hope that my story will be a warning, a reminder of what happens when procedure overrides compassion, when efficiency is valued above human life, when the machinery is allowed to grind forward without pause or reflection. I hope that someone will read these words and understand that the Imperium's greatest disasters are not always the result of malice or incompetence, but of diligence, of correct decisions made in the wrong context. I hope that someone will see the truth, even if the Imperium never does. But I do not believe it will happen. I do not believe that the machinery can be stopped or even slowed. I believe that it will continue as it always has, consuming everything in its path, until there is nothing left but ash and ruin. And I believe that there will be others like me, clerks and adepts and officials who perform their functions with diligence and precision and never once stop to consider the consequences of their actions. They will be promoted and commended and celebrated, and they will carry the weight of their guilt alone, just as I do, because the Imperium does not allow for confession or redemption. It only allows for service, and service demands silence. And so I remain silent, except for these words, this confession that will never be read, this warning that will never be heeded. I remain a cog in the machine, a component that functions as designed, a monster who was created by the very system he serves, and I will continue to serve, because there is nothing else I know how to do, because the Imperium does not offer alternatives, because the machinery grinds forward and I am carried along with it. But I will remember. For as long as I live, I will remember Calith's rest and the 4 billion souls I condemned with a keystroke. I will remember as an act of penance, as an acknowledgement of my guilt, as the only resistance I am capable of. And perhaps, in some small way, that will be enough. Perhaps it will have to be.